Hi everyone, and welcome to this STORK seminar series with Dr. Anne Hegsteden, which I think is going to be a really fascinating talk about a topic that many of us struggle with. Dr. Hegsteden is based within the Saarland University Institute of Sport and Preventive Medicine, which is a part of the FIFA Medical Centre of Excellence. So I think she's really perfectly placed to discuss something very statistical, but also from that elite sport point of view, which sometimes the two can, I think, be in conflict sometimes when you're talking about the practicalities as well as the statistics. So I think we couldn't find a better person to talk to us about this extremely important topic. And without further ado, I'm going to pass straight on over to Anne. Thank you so much for coming along today, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Here's Anne.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and participation. And so first of all, I really want to stress that I want to talk of how to deal with that small n, small effects dilemma, because I can't solve it. I think no one can. So if that's not enough for you for spending this hour, then I tell that right away. Something on the background of me talking about this topic. So the research behind it has been funded by the German Ministry of the Interior, which is responsible for promoting elite sport in Germany. And it has been published as an expertise in German language, so as a book, basically. But the central part of it has also been published in Science and Medicine in Football, so in English language and free for all to read. A short note on the wording of that talk, so that the main part of the talk is from the perspective of quasi-experimental trials, and the wording is that of the prevailing frequentist hypothesis testing approach. That's just for accessibility. If we want to go beyond that, we can do that in the discussion. That's for everyone to understand. So we start at the very bottom. Why sample size matters. So, I don't know if it's with me, the noise. So the challenge is in empirical science to get precise estimates or to detect small effects despite the unavoidable random variation in individual observations. Everyone knows that from daily experience. And the principle behind it is just as simple, because random deviations above and below the true value, they just middle out. They cancel each other out, if you want it like that. And obviously this principle works better and more reliably with more observations. That's all, no equation needed so far. And the second step towards understanding this dilemma is that small samples, suboptimal sample sizes, are associated with more severe problems than is usually thought. So suboptimal sample sizes combined with a negative study outcome, so with a non-significant result, there's no meaningful interpretation. I think everyone knows that. It is less well known that the suboptimal sample size combined with a positive result, so with a significant result, mostly, is already associated with severe problems. First of all, the positive predictive value of such a positive result, so the chance of it of being replicable in future studies with larger sample sizes and so on, is lower as with larger sample sizes. That's just statistical fact. That may be counterintuitive, because one may also think, well, if my study clears the bar with such a low sample size, then there must be a really strong effect behind that, but it's just not true. It's random variation. And also small trials tend to overestimate the size of the effect. And this combines in the so-called winner's curse. So if a small trial finds a significant result, the researcher is cursed with the risk of the result not being replicable. And even if it is replicable, then the effect size will very likely be smaller. Importantly, these are direct consequences of the small sample size, and the more sociological problems like publication bias and data dredging and p-hacking, they are to be added. That's on top. So what can we do? Well, the first and foremost option, as simple as that may sound, is to increase the sample size. If this is at all feasible, we should take that option. And only if it's really not possible, then we should go for other options. And there we have a specific toolbox, and I will talk about that later. And the two main points of that toolbox is first, to lower the required number of participants. So perhaps we can even avoid a mismatch between required and feasible sample size. And the second aim is to mitigate the negative impact of an eventually remaining unavoidable suboptimal sample size. And the third important set of tools is replication and triangulation. And now we come to the specific situation in elite sport. So this small n, small effects dilemma. Well, first of all, we have a highly competitive environment. So even tiny effects that may be completely irrelevant in leisure time sports can make the difference between winning and losing. And on the other hand side, elite is by definition a small fraction of all physically active people or people doing a certain sport. So we have by definition a small number of potential subjects. So we have a mismatch between the required sample size, because tiny effects or highly precise estimates require a high sample size. Remember slide 1, and the feasible sample size, even in principle. But other more general features of elite sports do also contribute. On the side of the required sample size, it's mainly the characteristics of our outcome measures. They are frequently complex constructs, such as fatigue or recovery needs, that cannot be just measured with one parameter, but that have to be inferred from different dimensions, which increase the required sample size. Many of our outcomes are multifactorial, so like training efficacy. And some are probabilistic with a high irreducible aleatoric uncertainty, such as injury risk. So we cannot hope to be able to perfectly predict when a sports injury will happen. And also we have rare events, also such as injuries. In injury studies, we have always severely imbalanced data sets. On the side of realistically feasible sample size, we have to see that elite athletes understandably have a focus on the individual risk-gain trade-off. So they will not comply with study requirements that do not exclusively aim to benefit personal performance. That's a difference, for example, as compared to rare diseases, where we have similar problems, but those patients really have the interest that their disease is investigated. That's complicates things even further. And well, the compatibility of complex study designs with the training process, so long baselines or extensive interventions, that's difficult. Now, if you have this mismatch between required and feasible sample size, what can we do? And I like to think of all those options that we have, and I will come to that in more detail, as a hierarchical toolbox. So we have foundations that must be addressed or must be respected. And then we can build upon that foundations with more sophisticated options. And the very basis of that pyramid, at least in my eyes, it's really the ground rules and tools. So we should not sacrifice basics like control, randomization, standardization, blinding, if at all possible. Of course, I know that these negotiations with the coaches and with the athletes are difficult, and it's difficult to sell that randomization is important for the results of that trial to be valuable. But we should fight for those foundations. And then there are 3 steps, 2 that I would say are standards, but standards that have a particular importance with small sample sizes, like optimizing the signal to noise ratio, and also a really traceable and specific sample size justification. That's always important for every trial, even if we can easily meet the required sample size, but it's much more important if that's a limitation. And then already a specific amendment to this basic craftsmanship is to increase the number of data points. And with a limited sample size, that means increase the number of data points that are collected per participant. And these 3 points, they are interlinked, and I want to go a bit into depth concerning them. First, how to find out how large the sample should be and what can be realized. And I apologize to statisticians that may be in the audience, so I really give a non-technical account on that. So required sample size is first determined by the standardized effect size, by the effect size that we want to detect. That's the signal to noise ratio. Then we have the acceptable error rates or the acceptable imprecision in our estimates and the number of outcome variables that we want to assess them. We have to adjust for multiple testing eventually. And then we have the intended study design that's really meaningful for the sample size calculation and the intended data analysis. The realistically feasible sample size, that's something more pragmatic. Of course, in a sport that is only done by a few people in a certain country, that will be more difficult than, for example, in soccer, where we have at least many who do it. The question, do we really need high performance athletes? That's something that can really help, and also incentivizing participation. But let's stay with the required sample size. And here it is important to bear in mind that this is not something that can be strictly calculated. A normative component, so subjective decisions are always necessary. So it's hardly possible to really give one number, what's the threshold of practical relevance for an effect. That's not dichotomous, that's a continuum, but we have to make a decision. So that will be normative. And if we start with this effect size or signal to noise ratio, if you want to regard it from that perspective, then we have some really simple considerations that can help a lot. So first, we have to maximize the signal. So think about the timing of tests. You want to get the maximum of the effect of your intervention. For example, in a training trial, you will try to schedule the final test after the acute effects of the last training bout has vanished, but before detraining effects occur. Or if you have an acute intervention like cold water immersion that will be addressed in the example later on, then of course you also want to have the maximum. And you will try to optimize intervention for efficacy. So consider its multifactorial nature and optimize and standardize to really get a maximum effect. And on the other hand, you will want to reduce noise. So a strict and targeted standardization. So think about the covariates, what influences your effect, what may influence your testing results. Prioritize the reliability of measures to reduce random measurement error. And also perhaps it may be possible to have repeated measurements for every time point, and then you can middle them and reduce random variation in your pre and post measurements. So very simple tools that we all know we should use, but you really should use them to their full extent if we have a sample size problem. Now, if we think of the standardized effect size as we use it for our sample size calculation, one very important thing that we should always bear in mind is that minimizing variation is a key tool in scientific trials. We just talked about that. We should do that and we should do it to the max. On the other hand, it's hardly feasible or appropriate in sports practice. So if we follow those guidelines for small samples, we kind of artificially maximize our observed effect size beyond what will be realistic for application in sports practice. But that tells us that in the context of applied sports science research, where worthwhile difference is really meant to mean practically relevant, making a difference in sports practice, then fixed thresholds for standardized effect sizes like a Cohen's d of 0.2, which is very popular, are generally not appropriate for determining the required sample size, nor for assessing the practical relevance of results for that matter. So what can we do? The solution, I think one possible solution is to estimate the smallest practically worthwhile difference. So that's really in the unit of measurement, second, gram, centimeters, and so on. And the expectable variation separately. Sources may be the distribution of performances across leading athletes in the world. There are papers out there who have done that. But another source could also be the subjective valuation of experienced coaches. I think that's perfectly licit. And it's for sure more meaningful than just taking a standard value like 0.2. And expectable variation, well, we can go for reliability trials that have been published, or preferably we perform that in-house. Concerning the study design, the main idea is to gather several observations or data points from each participant. And this alleviates the burden of gathering the required number of data points only by recruiting ever more subjects. Ideally, this takes the form of so-called single subject designs, which combine the elements of experimental manipulation, control, and repetition on the participant level. And this lowers the required number of participants for those paradigmatic group-based analyses. There are two principal subtypes of those single subject design. First, the replicate crossover design, and if you are dealing with individual responses, then you probably have heard of that. And as an alternative for non-reversible effects, mainly we have the multiple baseline design. With all single subject designs, or if you implement this repeated measurement and repeated intervention eventually within the individual, then you will get those hierarchical data sets with a mixture of within and between subject variation in your data set. So you need a matching data analysis. In many cases, this will mean a mixed model. A bit more detail on those single subject designs. The replicate crossover design is more well known. And basically it's straightforward. You have that crossover design. So you have intervention period and the control period for every subject with a washout phase in between. And now you replicate that crossover design. So you have at least 2 intervention periods and 2 control periods for every subject. That is the gold standard for the assessment of individual response. And its main strength is really you have a true replication of your intervention effect and a true replication of the intervention control comparison on the individual level. However, this design really requires a reversibility of your intervention effect within a realistic washout period. And this multiplies, when the design multiplies the study duration. So it's mainly applicable for short-term interventions, such like recovery interventions with reversible effect. As an alternative, there is the multiple baseline design that's kind of monitoring your outcome measure with repeated measurements, and you start with a baseline period, characterizing the baseline for the subject, and then at a certain time point, there's the start of your intervention, and you look on the change in your observations. And now the tweak in this design is that the time point of the transition between baseline and intervention is varied. And of course, if then the change in your outcome also varies in association with that transition, then this strengthens causal inferences. You just have one transition between baseline and intervention. That's a strength because reversibility of the effect is not required. On the other hand, the individual responses cannot be characterized with the same validity. However, those single subject designs, which, as I already mentioned, implement those elements of experimental manipulation, control, and repetition, and eventual also randomization on the individual level. So they are micro trials, if you want. So micro single subject trials, and then you can also analyze them, validly analyze them on the individual level, and eventually give feedback about the individual response to the participating athletes, which in my experience is a powerful incentive. So you really can tell them if they probably profit from the intervention. And I will show an example on that at the end of the talk. So now the critical point of all those considerations: how can I justify my sample size if it does not meet the calculated number? So if the required sample size cannot be met. And that's a very difficult question, and it will always be something that you have to argue about. There's no threshold. You already missed the threshold. That's the hard one. But the line of argument that I really like is basically from Larkins, and the argument goes that a suboptimal sample size is justified if a traceable case can be made that it makes, despite its suboptimal sample size and the ensuing limitation, a sustainable contribution towards answering the research question. And of course, there are no viable alternatives. So we traceably can't meet the required sample size. A second important point is the use of previous knowledge. And now we really move a bit beyond that clinical trial and hypothesis testing framework that we normally have. And of course, we always use previous knowledge if we do studies. We use them to inform standardization and to inform the optimization of our effect. But in this case, I specifically refer to previous pre-trial knowledge about the effect of interest, not about the time course of adaptation or about the causal structure and covariates and so forth, but really about the size of the effect itself. And this translates to Bayesian analysis with informative priors. And so that's a very, very short introduction. I hope no one is offended about what that basically means. So you have this pre-trial knowledge that we always have. We also have to justify doing the trial with elite athletes in the first place. So we need to have an idea of the size of the effect and make a case that at least it's not detrimental, very probably. And this pre-trial knowledge can come from various sources. There can be meta-analyses, there can be explicitly conducted preparatory trials, routine data, but also practical experience. This matches the Bayesian notion of probability as a subjective belief conditional on the current state of knowledge. And then we just translate this pre-trial expectation of a plausible range of values into the prior distribution, which we then update using the evidence from the current data of the current trial. And then we have this updated first distribution, and then we leave, so the post-trial knowledge, most current state of knowledge. I know that this has often been argued about, but has much less been applied, and I think that's a pity, particularly in our field. Of course, it is way beyond the scope of this talk to really discuss that in depth. But what I want to say is that if we should use, or if it's appropriate to use, Bayesian analyses, specifically with informative priors or not, depends on the task, depends on the analytical aim that we have. So if we want to do generalizable inference, like, so that's the usual scientific perspective, then of course, having to specify such an informative prior with its unavoidable degree of subjectivity is a drawback. In this case, we really want to know what can be inferred from our data, from our trial. However, in elite sports, generalizable inference is, I think, not very often the aim, at least in applied research in elite sports. The focus is rather on decision-making. So use or not use a specific intervention in a specific context, or even for the participating athletes. So, and what we need to inform such decisions is the most recent state of knowledge. And that's exactly this pre-trial expectation. We already have a bunch of knowledge, otherwise we would not test that in elite athletes. And then we update, we fine-tune these expectations with this very specific group of athletes, or we even do analyses on the individual level. And so in this very specific situation that we regularly encounter in elite sports, the analytical aim is on decision-making. And we have a justifiable expectation on where the effect of interest is plausibly located. And also we have really tiny samples, then I think a strong case can be made that this is a solution that should be employed more often than it currently is. Very short on Bayesian statistics, but the example will cover that again. And so now we come to the very tip of that pyramid, the continuative options. Now comes the fancy statistics. As two options that may perhaps still be handled by the subject matter scientists, it's first resampling and shrinkage methods, which really address specifically challenges that are associated with small samples. Resampling and shrinkage can reduce the upward bias that's introduced by suboptimal sample sizes, so reduce the overestimation of effect magnitude. And resampling can also give us an idea of the stability or instability of the results. So we can cover that in more depth in the discussion if someone is interested. And also data transformations or log transformation, for example, but there are a bunch of other options with the idea of bringing the empirical distribution closer towards the theoretical distribution. Just testing for for deviations from the normal distribution is really suboptimal in small sample sizes, because those tests will come out non-significant, even if there are clearly visible deviations from normality just because of the low sample size. And on the other hand, the reserves in power that can be tapped by matching the theoretical distribution closely are urgently needed in small sample sizes. One thing I was unsure if I should even still mention this, but magnitude-based inference or magnitude-based decision-making is not a valid method of statistics. So its aim is, of course, still valid, but as a method, it should not be applied. Rather, if you want, so use fully Bayesian methods with flat prior in this case, or use the clearly frequentist alternative equivalence testing. There's a bunch of literature on this, and I think it's really settled. There are also sophisticated approaches for dealing with small sample sizes, mainly from the field of rare diseases. There have been prominent projects in statistical research in the last decade, I would say, like the IDEAL project. They frequently publish their statistical code, but still applying those methods mandatorily calls for collaboration with an expert statistician. This is nothing that a subject matter scientist, how experienced ever, can handle. And on the other hand, the transferability to elite sports must really be questioned, mainly because of the willingness to comply with extensive study requirements is just lower as compared to patients who really want their illness to be investigated. Now, this is an overview over the toolbox that I have just presented. And if I would have just one slide for that talk, that would probably be the one I would show. And this figure or this slide also emphasizes the coherence between groups of tools. So it's not just stacking those tools up one on another, but there have to be meaningful combinations. Two very important points is that the flexibility in this toolbox. So we do not just propose one standard for small sample sizes, but it's really a toolbox that can be adapted or can be used to produce an adapted study plan for a specific situation. But this calls for transparency. So it's very important to specify a specific study plan, a detailed study plan, including specific data analysis before the start of data collection. Otherwise, positive predictive value will just go towards zero. And if you can't meet the required sample size, then there will remain limitations no matter how sophisticated you go with data collection and data analysis. And those limitations of predictive value mainly call for replication. So replication trials are really crucial in this kind of research. One could say that it's really about distributing the need for a lot of observations between the number of subjects in your trial, the number of data points per participant, and the ensuing replication trials. I already mentioned that finding a meaningful combination that's also feasible in your circumstances is very important. And I propose kind of a flow chart, and on top of that flow chart is deciding the strategic aim. So are we really mainly aiming for generalizable inference, or is our aim rather informing decisions under framework conditions close to the studies or even for the athletes themselves? And the second node would be deciding the main reason for the suboptimal sample size. So is it the exclusive participants? Elite is just small, or is it really, or is it rather a question of limited resources? Or, and that's also a crucial aspect in elite sports, is it the complexity of useful models? And I will come back to that. A third point is to reflect on the available statistical expertise. So it's not like drug development. We have generally much less money to pay for statistical advice. Clinical trial units at universities frequently offer that opportunity, but still reflect on your own capabilities and also of the help you can get. And it's not meaningful to employ fancy modeling techniques if you don't master them. I think that applies for me too. And then, of course, there are pragmatic aspects. How large really is the optimization pressure? How much benefit beyond clinical practice can we expect? What about effort and benefit in research, but also in practice? What about what's the meaning of a biomarker-based prediction model if then in the training situation where we need it, we can't do the measurements? And I want to propose 3 scenarios that are frequent from my experience in research in elite sport. And this flow chart, in case you can't read it well on your screen, it's from the publication in Science and Medicine in Football. So there you can probably read it in more detail. So the top is the basics. Minimize the required N and optimize the available N by really employing good craftsmanship and good relations with the coaches. And so in many cases, one can succeed in making the practicable sample size meet the requirements, and then the problem is solved. But if not, then we have this elite scenario where the main limiting factor is really the exclusive subjects. And so you have to try, you can't increase that number. And then you have to get more from each individual. And really, particularly in the elite subjects, they will not, or in rare cases, do science for the sake of science. So they want to have benefits for decision-making in their training process. So that would be the scenario where I really think that using the Bayesian statistics with informative priors as the main analysis is beneficial. Importantly, this does not have to be exclusive. So you can use one kind of analysis for decision-making and analyze the main data set, for example, with a flat prior or even with frequentist methods for your inferential goals. The important thing is to specify it in advance. So the elite scenario with get more from each individual, use a monitoring approach, use single subject designs and analyze them by using informative prior, using previous knowledge. The second one is the pilot trial scenario where limited resources, limited lab time, limited money is the bottleneck. And then you obviously have to get more from each test and minimize variation. So go for strict standardization, homogeneous groups, and maximize the signal. In that case, you would rather not use previous knowledge. It's a pilot trial, so it's you do not have much of that. So you have to either go for the standard frequentist analyses using all what you can get for increasing power. And the third one, and that's really something that, if considering what papers come out in the recent years, it's something very important. So it's about omics and machine learning techniques, prediction models, and so forth. So if you need very complex models, high dimensional models, many explanatory features to analyze variance and get suitable predictive power, and that in our multifactorial outcomes, that can really be the case. Then you need really big samples. So it's not for nothing that this is called a big data scenario. There are ways, Bayesian additive regression trees, for example, that can gradually reduce the number of data points needed to have such models learn. But there is a hard limit to that. So there is really a limit beyond which, for such complex models and the mismatch with sample size, that's doomed to fail. You can perhaps still publish this, omit that test set, but it will not be replicable. So bias variance trade-off and the curse of dimensionality, it's this problem in machine learning speech, and it's the scarce data bias more in the statistics terminology. That also already leads me to the example that I would like to present, and this has luckily, after really a long way, been accepted for publication, been published last week. And in this trial, we implemented the combination between a single subject design, in this case, a replicate crossover, and analysis, Bayesian analysis with an informative prior based on a published meta-analysis to assess response to cold water immersion as a recovery intervention in soccer. The guys you see on that photo did not participate on that trial. It has been done in the German 4th soccer league. And first, to the pretrial knowledge, that's based on the Poppendiek meta-analysis from 2013 about the effect of cold water immersion on performance recovery in trained athletes. So it's really about performance measures, and making long things short, for the specific situation in this trial. The idea is decision-making. We expected a 5% performance benefit after cold water immersion as compared to control. So for the combination of football-specific exercise to induce fatigue, whole body cold water immersion, and a sprint performance measure. Negative effects, we deemed them as highly unlikely, which we translated to 2 standard deviations away from 0. Of course, you see there's a subjective component in this, and the distribution form was derived from previous own work and from routine data in professional soccer. We then did this replicate crossover. So for every player, 2 times cold water immersion after induction of fatigue, the post-test 1 day later, 24 hours, and 2 times the control condition, seated rest. And if you just look on the variability plot on the left side bottom, control pre-post differences on the left for every player and cold water immersion points on the right, you see that cold water immersion in fact seems to be effective. And it's sprint time, so lower is better. There also seems to be 1 player with a non-too adverse response. On the right side, you see the same, same data points plotted in a different way. That's already from the publication. And you see the pre-post differences for the players separated for control and cold water immersion. So the main effect is beneficial with a p-value of 0.016. Normal frequentist analysis. And now for what's really interesting, that is the comparison between control and cold water immersion. I show the 5-meter acceleration results here. The 30-meter results were much less impressive. You can see them in the publication. On the left side top, it's for the replicate crossover design, and I don't know if you can read it. The bottom interval is for the frequentist confidence interval. The middle line is for the Bayesian analysis with a diffuse prior, and the top one is for the Bayesian analysis with the informative prior. The vertical lines are the 0 line at the right. The dashed line is for the prior, and the finely dotted line is the data mean, which you can see runs, of course, through the frequentist mean. Those intervals for the group-based analyses are quite similar, so no big numerical difference. On the bottom, you see the first crossover only. So what would we see if we had just conducted a normal crossover design? Then the difference between the approaches is a bit bigger. That's explained by the lower number of data points. But what's really interesting is on the right side, I think, and that's the analysis on the individual level. And there, of course, the frequentist confidence intervals are very wide, derived from a linear model fit for every person, just 2 data points, that's really little. Whereas the Bayesian credible intervals are much narrower, but are dominated by the prior, so they deviate only slightly. We can discuss then what's more appropriate, how sure we can be about the transferability of our prior and so forth. But as there were really many data points in that meta-analysis, I think So me as a coach, I would prefer the credible tools. But it's also a message that just doing these Bayesian analyses, it's not a guarantee of getting a more precise estimate, more accurate estimate in every case. One last new aspect is what to do if the sample size is really just too low. Just not do the trial, just leave that research question unanswered is one option, but I think we should also look beyond that life science methods package, for example, into aggregating subjective judgments and crowd intelligence, frugal heuristics, and so forth, approaches that rather come from social sciences and humanities, but which can perhaps be applied when our life science methods just let us down. We have just advertised a PhD scholarship that will test those ideas in injury forecasting in soccer. To wrap that up, first, I would like to summarize the elite sport environment. So what characterizes the field of applied research in elite sports? What are the challenges? The upper half, the small n, small effects dilemma, I think we have talked enough about that. But there are also beneficial characteristics, I would call them. And that is the focus on decision-making, which offers us the opportunity to use previous knowledge, to give our tiny data sets a kind of a head start. And this pre-trial knowledge is very generally available if we intend to do research in elite athletes, applied research. One could really say it's a prerequisite. I wouldn't dare talking to a coach for access to his elite athletes or her elite athletes if I can't make a strong case that at least I will not harm them. And we also have diverse sources of evidence. And I think we should also really try to elicit this expert knowledge and include it in applied research. That's a source that can offer a lot, I think, and could be used in a more structured way. So for the main messages, mind the severe limitations of small studies. And this applies with negative as well as with positive results. You are not done if your result turns out significant. Estimate required sample size based on practical relevance. Expert knowledge is meaningful. Competition data can be meaningful. Fixed thresholds for standardized effect sizes are not. Consider the strategic aim. We have talked a lot about that. Distribute the burden of getting many observations between your current study, your current number of participants, the number of data points per participant, replication trials, and perhaps also take a stance on previous knowledge. Transparency is crucial. So to limit further going down on your positive predictive value. So pre-registration, code and data sharing, and open discussion of limitations that's associated with your sample size. And last but not least, seek expert statistical cooperation, or at least counseling. And the key tools in that toolbox, from my perspective at least, it's the single subject designs for data collection. It's the Bayesian statistic on the side of data analysis. And it's also a respect for hard limits from the perspective of the general approach. So I think of the big data scenario mainly. And as my last slide, I have kind of a conversation card that's really just to stimulate discussion concerning applied resource in an elite sport context. We should perhaps forget about golden bullets and grand theory and high dimensional prediction models, because such perfection is just unattainable based on the framework conditions we can't change. So the requirements are just impossible to meet. What we may need, or what we may rather need, is an adaptive toolbox. So a box of tools that may, even under ideal circumstances, perhaps not lead to perfect results, but who work well in the circumstances we have. So analyze the task and framework conditions and look beyond the RCT or big data methods horizon. In Germany, there is a sentence that the dumbest farmers have the biggest potatoes. So they may not have a research department on their farm, but they really know their very specific circumstances. And so their methods work well. They may not be generalizable, and they may not be communicable even, but they work in their specific circumstance. So I argue for street smart science, and for those of you who like a more literature-like terminology that can be found under the term of ecological rationality. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I hope for a vivid discussion.
Thank you so much, Anne. Fantastic. I love the final image to wrap that up. Very nice. Guys, hopefully, Anne, if it's okay with you, we've got some questions coming in, if you've got some time to stay for discussion. Guys, as you know, the way we usually do this is, if you want to pop your questions into the chat, I'm happy to read them out and respond. However, if you prefer to just unmute yourself and talk, ask your question directly, that's absolutely fine too. So just let us know. But sure, I'll start reading here anyway and see. And we've got a question from Robin. What recommendations would you give for the issue of with multiple comparisons, differences, correlations in studies with small sample sizes? Would it be better to treat the research as exploratory and not correct the alpha level?
So my recommendation is to fix one primary outcome in advance, traceably. So not only in the final manuscript, but really in the study plan. And then you can test for that one and treat all the others as exploratory.
So you'd still be fine with go ahead with your exploratory research, just predefine your kind of primary outcome, test that, and then just see what happens after that, but treat it very much as exploratory. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I mean. Because I think you can take one of those, but you have to do it in advance. Mm-hmm. And then even things like hypothesis testing, that's perfectly justified. But then for all the secondary outcomes, you should treat them as exploratory. But you can do it. I think that's perfectly fine. And it's also a kind of making use of a limited sample size. So when I draw blood from those athletes, why should I not use that blood and measure more parameters? That would be, I just can throw the rest of the blood away, but that would make no sense. But then I must be honest and say, that was the one parameter I was really interested in and I had a specific hypothesis about, and all the others, well, let's see.
Yeah. That's actually, I have a follow-up question then, or sorry, Chris, I'm jumping the queue now, but because I have my camera off, I'll go ahead and do it anyway. This is something I'm struggling with a little bit at the moment because I'm about to pre-register a trial that we're running. When I had the initial idea for the study, I was primarily interested in interaction. Alongside this planning this original study, I was running a meta-analysis, and as often happens, the estimates came out much smaller and much more variable than I kind of initially had thought. And now what I'm starting to think is actually the main effect should be the priority of my original study, and we'll keep the intervention and explore the interaction as well. Do you think it's reasonable or okay? I haven't actually, I'm still planning this. I need to get it registered fairly soon. Is it okay to estimate my sample based on the main effect and then to just consider the potential interactions as exploratory? Because I'm starting to think that I was over ambitious in what I wanted to do initially, but at the same time, I still think it's a very interesting study and I want to do it. I'm just deciding what's the best way to be kind of true to the process as it's gone. Sorry, that's maybe a rambly way to explain. I don't know if I made any sense there.
I hope I got it correctly. So you did not yet registered. So you are still in the planning. Yes, planning. Sure. So if anyone is a doctor, I'm not a statistician, I'm a physician. So I'm not qualified to give you statistical advice. But for my understanding, that would be perfectly fine. And it would even be fine to switch something as long as you make that that deviation transparent in the final manuscript.
I think my difficulty right now is that when I initially planned it, when I got the ethical approval for the study, I assumed that the main effect was quite. Yeah. I had quite a strong belief in the main effect. However, when I did the meta-analysis, I reduced my belief in the main effect, which then obviously has a knock-on on the interaction. But I agree with you. If I haven't actually run anything yet, so I think registering now, being as clear as possible, is probably fine. Question here from Chris, and I'm very, very interested in hearing this answer too. What would be the benefit of using a flat prior in Bayesian analyses? I thought that this approach was to be avoided. And does the use of Bayesian methods reduce the issues of normality, sphericity, equality of variance, etc., that occur often with our small samples? Struggle to find a clear answer on this.
Again, I'm not a trained statistician, and I give my answer to this. And if anyone in the audience wants to add something, please feel free. So, being able to use, to systematically integrate previous knowledge about the effect of interest in your analysis, that is, use an informative prior, I think is the main advantage of Bayesian analysis in our context. So in elite sport research, but there are other advantages as well. One is the more intuitive interpretation of interval estimates. So of credible as compared to confidence intervals. They just can be interpreted the way confidence intervals normally are, but as we probably know, their true definition is much less straightforward. Also, Bayesian analyses are generally more efficient, so they make more of your sample size that has to do with the differing notion of probability as subjective belief conditional on a state of knowledge on the one hand side, and that long run relative frequency on the other, but it also has been empirically shown that this is the case. So I think that Bayesian analyses with flat priors or diffuse priors or improper priors, whatever you prefer, and it's not the same, it's perfectly valid.
Again, I'm going to have a follow-up question now, and I'm going to try to phrase this. I'm not sure myself what exactly I'm saying here. My understanding that the difficulty or the problem with flat priors, particularly in sport and exercise research, is that they allow for what could be biologically implausible values in terms of they're essentially from nothing to infinity. Is it feasible to design a prior if you don't have enough information to inform a prior based on your study? Could you put an informative prior just based on biological plausibility? For example, we know that a jump height can only increase by so much. You know, there's only so, we're not grasshoppers, there's only so far we can go. Would that be a potential solution to overcoming issues with flat priors? Apologies if that made no sense.
So I'm arguing from the practitioner's perspective. And for example, in that cold water paper, initially we tried improper priors and flat priors, and then because it's just more, I think more straightforward, we used flat priors with a lot, so mean zero, very large variability. For my notion, they are just a technical tool to express we just don't know. And honestly, I'm not very concerned if their tails reach values that are physiologically implausible. In fact, every bell curve does. Very close to the zero line, but every bell curve does. So I'm not disturbed by that in any way. But perhaps statisticians are. So that would not deter me from using them, let's say it that
way. Chris, your question, feel free to jump in. Is that what we were, is that what you?
Yeah, in terms of the discussion around flat priors, sorry, yeah, I'm quite happy with that. The issue around whether it allows us to be less concerned about normality, sphericity, so on and so forth. That's one I've really struggled with, because I've seen some authors saying that we don't need to worry about that at all, and other authors saying that we still need to worry about it in the same way as frequentist. And not being a statistician, I don't know which one to believe.
I just don't know. So me neither. Not being a statistician, I just don't know.
Fair enough.
It's a real shame. We had a statistician here earlier, but he seems to have popped out, because I've asked this question from Paul Swinton in Scotland before, and I can do well, it's probably going to be a terrible job of trying to remember what he told me on this before, but my understanding is that when we're talking about quite small samples and potentially unusual distributions, or potentially issues like you've mentioned there with distributions, Bayesian and frequentists can end up performing in the same way, because in both situations, we're tackling the same problems. So as the samples get bigger, I think it becomes less important. However, I think that there are certain things with small samples that neither approach can do. And I think that probably links back into what Anne was saying. In certain situations, the sample is going to be just too small to have enough information for the model to actually deal with it one way or another. Now, I don't know if I made any sense there. And it's a shame that Paul popped out, because I'm also not a statistician, but
So I think that is true. And also the information about the distribution type is finally a pre-trial knowledge that we introduce when we use those Bayesian methods. And in that paper on cold water immersion, we discussed that explicitly in the supplement. So in that case, we based that choice of distribution form on routine data, because to discern distribution form, you really need huge amounts of data points. Otherwise, you just can't say.
So does that mean, would it be fair to say then that if you have sufficient pre-trial information to be able to be quite confident about your distribution within the study, then your Bayesian approaches are more capable of overcoming, of accounting for that within your own study when incorporating the new data? However, if your pre-trial information is also based on very small studies and you're not very confident about distribution, then there's probably not really, there's only so much that your Bayesian approach can do. Is that fair to say, or am I going off target altogether?
So with all due respect for the trained statisticians, yes, of course, that's an additional degree of uncertainty if you have no empirical data about your distribution form. Of course, there are also theoretical ways to argue how that distribution should look like for blood values, for example. That's quite easy. But yeah, that's a very good example of the point where you really should collaborate with a trained statistician. So those finer details of technique, I think that we will never master them to the degrees of someone who has done university studies on that subject. Just fair to say. But on the other hand, I also made the experience that the farther you get on that way, and the more fruitful the collaboration is. So just having a statistical collaborator or consultant is no excuse for not working hard to understand the methods you try to employ.
That actually aligns quite well with a tweet I saw, was it earlier today or yesterday, where somebody said that a very useful part of a statistical course could be, or could the most useful part of a statistical course be training people to explain their questions to a statistician, to actually be able to articulate what we're trying to find out, what we have, what we know, what we don't know about the topic, because I think that's sometimes a real barrier in communication, in that we don't have the language to explain what they need to know, but they don't have that subject-specific understanding of what we're doing. So I think that communication can be really difficult. And as you say, Anne, the more the collaboration progresses, maybe the easier it becomes to explain.
Yes, and if so in my experience, at least, if the collaboration should be really fruitful, then we also need that, like, moving towards your partner from the statistical side. So the statisticians also need a certain degree of subject matter understanding to make things really work beyond the very basics. But that's also easier if they see that we are trying hard.
Yeah.
My experience, they are also willing to buckle down and make things work.
You mean it's not okay to just send a spreadsheet and say, here's numbers, tell me things?
That's a matter of course, but I think we should go much beyond that.
Tell me interesting things. And guys, I'm aware of everyone's time, but we've gone a little over the usual hour. Does anybody have any follow-up or additional questions for Anne while we're here? I think we're we're all good. And thank you so much. That was so interesting. It's one for sure that I thoroughly enjoyed it during, but I know it's one I'm going to need to go back to the recording and stop and zoom in and really try to get everything, because there was so much interesting information in there that I know it's going to take me a little time to absorb it all. But thank you so much. I think it's such an important topic and such an important conversation. And I really enjoyed it. So on behalf of STORK and everyone's here, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation again. And if anyone has additional questions or points of criticism, please feel free to write me an email.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
All right. I'm going to just stop.